Good evening. Welcome to the Sather Lectureship for this year. This lectureship was established in 1929 through a gift from John Schaefer, who endowed this lectureship in memory and in honor of his son, Kent Schaefer, who was a PhD in 1907. The lectureship is a roll call of very prominent New Testament scholars in the 20th century. And just to mention a few whose names everyone will know: Rudolf Bultmann, Amos Wilder, Gerhard von Rad, Niels Dahl, which has special significance for our speaker tonight, Gunther Bornkamm, C.K. Barrett, Ernst Käsemann, Christer Stendahl, W.D. Davies, and the list simply goes on with people of that caliber, and we're very fortunate tonight to add to the luster of this roll call with our speaker and to introduce our lecturer for this year, Professor Adela Collins.
I am delighted to introduce to you all my colleague and friend, Tord Carlson Seim. She is on leave at present from her position as Professor of New Testament at the University of Oslo. She was granted a leave so that she could serve as the director of the Norwegian Institute in Rome, a position she took up in 2007. She also served as the Dean of the Faculty of Theology at the University of Oslo from 1991 to 1995. And she has been a senior fellow at the Institute for the Advanced Study of Religion at the University of Chicago in 1996. Her proposal to the Norwegian Academy of Science and Letters for a grant to establish a collaborative research group at the Center for Advanced Study was the first application from a theological faculty to be funded by the Academy. The topic was Metamorphoses, Resurrection, Body, and Transformative Practices in Early Christianity. She co-edited a book with the same title, consisting of essays produced by that academic group, published in 2009. Her book, entitled The Double Message: Patterns of Gender in Luke Acts, published in 1994, has had a significant impact on the field. Here's a sampling of the articles that she has published in journals and as chapters of books. Children of the Resurrection, Angelic Asceticism in Luke Acts. Abraham, Ancestor or Archetype, a comparison of Abraham language in 4th Maccabees and Luke Acts. The Virgin Mother, Mary and Ascetic Discipleship in Luke. Paul's Discourse on Desire and Devotion in 1 Corinthians 7. Johannine Echoes in Montanism, in early Montanism. Motherhood and the Making of Fathers in Antiquity, contextualizing genetics in the Gospel of John. Interfacing House and Church, converting household codes to church order, and many more. She was active in the Faith and Order Commission of the World Council of Churches for many years. She is in great demand in Europe and the United States as a judge on boards granting major prizes and as an advisor to university presidents, deans, and rectors on the topics of administration, tenure, and the appointment of major endowed professorships. Please join me in welcoming Professor Carlson Seim.
Thank you. When listening to you on record, you wonder, is that really me? And thinking back on my life, yes, I think it is. All the more pleased I am to be here today. I was surprised to be asked. I have to admit I didn't know about lectures and had to become aware of how important they are and in which significant company I find myself, and that's humbling. I also understand that this year is an experiment in the way of doing it. And all the more pleased I am that I have only one lecture one day, each day, and don't have to do it all in one go. I thought I would explain how I'm going to do it. And I'm going to do the Gospel of John, as the program says, today, under the headline for all of them, Jesus in Liminal Transit. And the liminal transit is between the resurrection and whatever kind of disappearance that follows sometime afterwards. And we'll today deal with the Gospel of John, and that is chapter 20. Tomorrow we do Luke, chapter 24. And the last day we'll deal with endings and the difficulties attached to endings. Since there is no beginning in this, I could deal with endings. And we would reflect on how endings multiply, even within the canon itself. So the endings I'm going to talk about on Thursday will be the chapter 21 in John and all the discussions attached to that. And in the case of Luke, what about Luke? I'll deal with the beginning of Acts, which in fact serve as a second ending to Luke, and what happens when you add these endings, and how you in a way amputate any attempt at closure. And that would be the sort of the undergirding discussion on in the last lecture. Today I'll deal with Jesus in liminal transit in the Gospel of John, and I've called it In Transit from Tangibility to Text. I didn't bring text, so I hope either you have them in your head, or I'm not very particular, so I hope you have them in your head, or perhaps brought a book along. In an article some years ago, the former dean of this place, Harold Attridge, who surprised me with the invitation, which meant that I'm here today, speaks of the Noli Me Tangere scene as a dramatic episode with an enigmatic touch. The great variety of readings illustrates this. Excuse me. It was not a good beginning. The great variety of readings illustrates the potential both to encourage and to dishearten those who engage with it. Some interpretations are playful, some are profound, some are insightful, and some are right out silly. This is Harold Attridge speaking. Many overinterpret the problematic verse, but in the end do not fully account for it. And Attridge also acutely observes that most readings either ignore or have difficulty with the prohibition which Jesus issues that Mary Magdalene should not touch him because he is not yet ascended. The problem, or perhaps rather the conundrum, is located not so much in the prohibition itself as in its motivation and the way in which the prohibition and the motivation relate. Attempts at solving the problem or easing the interpretative discomfort through textual conjectures have never been widely accepted. We have to deal with the text as it stands. Mary Magdalene is the last of several women with whom Jesus interacts in the fourth Gospel. And she appears for the first time in a larger group of women assembled at the cross. The women at the cross belong to a fixed part of the tradition, but the Gospels differ as to who they were. In the Synoptic Gospels, the presence of women disciples at the cross introduces their continuous role as witnesses at the crucifixion, at the burial, and at the empty tomb. In the Johannine version, however, the aspect of witness is of less importance. In fact, it's almost lacking, which is unusual in John with its emphasis on witness more generally. In John, kinship is emphasized. Two of the women are said to be Jesus' mother and her sister, neither of whom are mentioned as present by any of the synoptic gospels. Moreover, the two relatives are mentioned first, before Mary, wife of Clopas, if she is not identical with his aunt, and Mary Magdalene, who comes last, where she is always listed first in the other gospel accounts. In John, kinship, thus, are brought to the foreground as a group assembled at the cross represents a unique blend of family and friends. This is all the more remarkable since on earlier occasions in this gospel narrative, family and friends are always marked off as separate groups. This is the first time they come together. Among the women, the focus is on the mother of Jesus, who remains unnamed throughout the Gospel of John. Furthermore, she is, like some of the other women, addressed by Jesus simply as Ginai, as it also happened the first time at the wedding in Cana. This form of address is neither hostile, nor is it an endearment, but a polite demarcation of some distance. Among the men at the cross, the central person apart from Jesus himself is another anonymous figure, the beloved disciple. He is not explicitly included in the list of those present, but later in the dialogue he is assumed to be there. Like Mary Magdalene, he does not represent kinship by the flesh, but is one of those who, according to John 15, are philoi, Jesus' friends, those whom Jesus loves. The monumental scene at the cross thus resumes the negotiations of kinship, which, I think, constitute a constantly ongoing discourse in this gospel. Under Jesus' exalted on the cross, kinship and discipleship meet and interchange. Jesus' distancing himself from his mother, indicated already the first time she appears at the wedding at Cana, when he began his public mission, becomes complete this second time, when all is completed or all is finished. Her presence on these two occasions represents an inclusio, framing Jesus' earthly existence and the kinship that was by the flesh. As Jesus transfers her motherhood to the beloved disciple, whose matter did not come from her blood and whom she never nurtured, and as he provides the beloved disciple with a mother of whose matter the disciple has none and by whose milk he was never nurtured, kinship is redefined and requalified as being by generation of birth from above, which is by spirit and not by flesh. There is no further mention of a mother, only a father whose children they now become. The friends whom Jesus loves are to be his brothers and probably also his sisters. In the later encounter with Mary Magdalene in the garden, we are getting closer, by the tomb, Jesus tells her to go to his brothers and sisters, using for the first time kinship language as a shared frame of reference, and speaks in an equally unprecedented manner of my father and your father, marking a distinction, but more remarkably also a commonality. Thus, as the mother is being sidetracked, if not dismissed, Mary Magdalene gains prominence as an individual encounter takes place between her and Jesus, a type of scene for which John seems to have a certain preference, two persons together. During their encounter, Jesus moves from using the address woman also to Mary. He moves from that to calling her by her name, Maria, thereby expressing a progression in relationship. It is widely recognized that when Jesus calls Mary by name, it recalls the description of his own in John 10, to whom she then belongs. The shepherd calls his sheep by name, and they recognize his voice. Thus, hearing him say her name, Mary understands that the person she took to be the gardener, in fact, is Jesus. Her response, however, is not by name, but by Rabboni. The exchange between the two is marked by forms of address that simulate Hebrew or Aramaic language, perhaps in a Greek dress. The address Rabboni has been interpreted in various ways, as a false clinging to the former relationship or as charged with emotional resonance, defining Mary's reversion to her mother tongue as an expression of affection. And this is a typical register of interpretations of this text. It may also be that Mary is using a familiar title that Jesus himself, according to John 13:13, had deemed appropriate. My own interpretation is that the exchange reveals that Mary is among those who are his. She is cast as a disciple, even if she is never listed as Matthetes. Maria Magdalene is in the garden searching for the body of Jesus after it, at the beginning of the same chapter, has been ascertained that the tomb where his dead body had been laid is empty. And the question about the whereabouts of his body therefore has become urgent. I'll deal more with that story on the last day. The initial plot of the garden scene is therefore Mary's search for the corpse or the Jesus who has gone missing. When Mary remains at the tomb after the other two disciples have gone home, she is weeping, and her tearful mourning is repeatedly underlined. 4 times attention is called to this, twice by the narrator, once by the angels, and finally by Jesus himself. In fact, she is the only character in the Gospel who does what Jesus projects in 16:20. Truly you will weep and mourn. In chapter 16, this prediction is further supported by the complex metaphor of a woman giving birth, which represents not an illustration, but rather an explication of what the departure of Jesus means to his disciples. When a woman is in labor, she has pain because her hour has come, but when the child is born, she no longer remembers the anguish because of the joy of having brought a human being into the world. Likewise, the pain and anguish of the disciples will be turned to joy when Jesus will see them again. The disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord, as it says in 20:20. Also in John 3, the figure of regeneration from water and spirit pervades the dialogue. That's the dialogue with Nicodemus. Again with reference to the death departure of Jesus. In a momentous manner, these two previous passages converge in the resurrection stories in chapter 20, the first part, 11 to 23, and add a level of metaphorical meaning to the narrative, indicating that it concerns not death as much as life-giving and birth from above to new eternal life. Death and birth are circumstances or processes which in most cultures represent or include a state of liminality, also often emphasized by ritual. The concept of liminality was developed within the theory of transformation rites, which laid out a pattern of 3 ritual stages. A first preliminary stage of abandonment and separation leads into a second phase characterized by indetermination and vulnerability, until the ritual passage of transformation is concluded through reincorporation or just incorporation, and reintegration or integration. Whether re should be included is a debate in itself. The moments of separation and incorporation presents themselves as punctual acts of transitions, while the middle stage, which has become known as the liminal phase, involves extended duration. In this often lengthy phase, one is betwixt and between. That is, neither here nor there. One is stripped of the old being and is neither me nor not me, naked and vulnerable, often in unfamiliar surroundings and sometimes with an absence of familiar structures. This pattern is now very often used in interpretation. There's nothing original in a way in applying it, even though one might discuss the various phases. But this pattern seems in general terms to describe what is happening in John 20 between Jesus' crucifixion, defined as death and burial, and defined as ascension, return to the Father. The elusiveness of Jesus, as well as an oscillation between familiarity and strangeness in his interaction with the disciples, may be interpreted as liminal features. In a brief article with quite some impact, Mary Rose D'Angelo suggests that the shifting reaction of the risen Jesus when he first prohibits Mary Magdalene, what he shortly afterwards invites Thomas to do. This is one of the major problems in the chapel, that Mary Magdalene is prohibited, but Thomas is allowed, and that would be my clue in the end, how to explain that. But she answers then, she suggests, Mary Rose D'Angelo, that the shifting reaction of the risen Jesus reflects an intermediate liminal situation during which Jesus undergoes some kind of transformation. She calls attention to a passage in the Apocalypse of Moses, where she finds that Adam, before his death, gives Eve a similar instruction to the one in John 20:17. Adam tells Eve how she, when he dies, should deal with his unburied body. Quote, "When I die, leave me alone and let no one touch me until the angel of the Lord shall say something about me. Do not rise to pray to God until I shall give back my spirit into the hands of the one who has given it." Unquote. After the death of Adam, Eve and Seth have a vision in which God comes to the dead Adam in an eagle-drawn chariot of light, preceded by the angels. It's a marvelous vision. The angels first perform a liturgy interceding for Adam as God's image and the work of God's hands. Then an angel blows a trumpet, and they all announce God's mercy on Adam, and the 6-winged seraph takes Adam to the lake of Acheron and washes him 3 times. As a parallel to John 20:17, this passage from the Apocalypse of Moses is at best inadequate. Jesus is neither seen nor is he treated as a corpse. That is one of the problems in the text. The corpse is nowhere to be found. And there is no indication that this body is conceived of as being unclean. In fact, the point of the Johannan story is to the contrary. Mary is looking for his displaced dead body only to encounter a living person. This is a striking difference to the Adam-Eve passage that, to my mind, undermines the analogy. Furthermore, liminality does not imply impurity. It may, but normally it doesn't. And in the end, Delangelo does refrain from saying that Mary would be ritually unclean if she were to touch Jesus. This similarity is just reduced to little more than saying that the touching of Jesus or Adam's body in some way would constitute a violation, not only to Mary and Eve, but also to Jesus or Adam in his strange state, or perhaps the holy and awesome process each undergoes. Nevertheless, Maria Angela may still be right in suggesting that the prohibition in John 20:17 is motivated by a liminal not yet situation, since Jesus says that she should not hold on to him, since he has not yet ascended, and leaves her with a message that she should tell his brothers that he is ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. The first question now to be asked is simply, did Mary violate his liminal status? Did she touch? Did she show signs of wanting to touch him? Or are Jesus' words simply a preventive action, a demarcation? And that's why I wanted the pictures, which I couldn't get the computer to do here. However much art history has struggled with this, she almost does it, but they are not quite sure that they could make the contexts visible. The attempts at answering this question are too copious to cover. Therefore, only a brief sampling. And this is fantastic reading and story writing, where the fantasy of interpreters is just amazing. This is then the brief sampling. Mary Magdalene has been cast as the stereotypical clinging woman, trying to hold back her man, not realizing that the days of being with him as he was is past history. This is very frequent, this interpretation. The next one, or series of next one, Jesus is weaning Mary from an inappropriate way of relating to him. And to many interpreters, this further provides a psychagogic or didactic paradigm for how the gospel is supposed to guide the reader to greater maturity in faith. It may also be directed to Mary's further activity. The garden is no remaining place. She should rather be on her way to the new locus of his presence in the world, the community of his brothers, and probably sisters. The focus is primarily on Mary's desire or deficiency, requiring various kinds of further insight, and less on the state of Jesus. Most interpretations are concerned with her and not with him. Some suggest that the motive clause in verse 17, because I have not yet ascended to my Father, is a rhetorical question expecting a negative reply, conveying that Jesus has already ascended. Another proposal is the reading, for you I'm not ascended to the Father. Jesus, glorified on the cross, has gone to the Father, but Mary has not yet realized that the risen Jesus also has been glorified. Jesus thus redirects her to the community of his brothers, which, in a mysterious way, is his glorified body. Furthermore, the Song of Songs is frequently drawn upon as an intertext, which invites sexual innuendos and an erotic relation. Mary Magdalene is cast as being in search for a beloved, but not finding him, calling him, but receiving no answer, until she finally finds him, holds on to him while declaring that she will not let him go. Equally unpersuasive is van Tilburg's exploitation of the Hellenistic philosophical discourse about love between a male teacher and his male students or disciples. Interpretations also sometimes explore a generic affiliation between the garden scene and fixed features of popular romance stories from Hellenistic and early imperial period. Mary's search for Jesus and her attempt to passionately embrace him is read in light of recognition scenes common to such stories, which describe how a long-lost lover is rediscovered after a plot marked by misunderstandings and lost hope until anagnoresis finally takes place, and everyone is happy in the end. Jesus' retort is then a violation of narrative conventions, since physical contact and reunion is never denied in the recognition scenes unless anagnoresis, is that how you pronounce it in English, has not yet taken place. However, the Johannine scene leaves its literary parallels behind. Jesus' resurrection does not merely re-establish the tangible present that was before, but points towards a new mode of being together. This is the reason why Mary is told to let go, so that Jesus may leave once again and return to the Father, so that his temporary and particular presence may be converted into an everlasting universal presence. In their diversity, all these attempts share the fundamental assumption that Mary somehow invites touch or attempts to touch Jesus. However, there is no narrative report of any action on Mary's part, but for the fact that she twice turns around to face him as he speaks to her. You can see that it is paintings, which I cannot show her, because she has a sort of being in two directions at the same time. Both times the same term is used, the various forms of Strafain. Choreographically, as the paintings show, the second turn is very awkward. She is already looking at him, although without recognizing him at this stage, since she believes he's the gardener. The point of having her turn twice in the same direction seems to be that every time Jesus speaks to her, she responds by speaking and by seeing. Not only the words, but also the gaze is important. But there is no touching. The idea that Mary, on her own initiative, touches Jesus or clings to him, as some say, is simply inferred from Jesus' prohibiting words, either by way of logic or by way of grammar. Since the prohibition employs the present and not the aorist imperative, this is taken to mean that he speaks in order to stop an action already taking place. Do not hold on to me, or more colloquially, don't be touching me. However, it is possible, even likely, that the present imperative in John 20:17 is employed to express not a durative, but rather a connotative aspect. Jesus' admonishment is preemptive. Do not attempt to touch me. Do not approach me. Which is also more in line with the choice of the verb haptomai for touching. In plain words, Jesus prohibits an act which has not taken place. According to the narrative, or has not been attempted even to take place. According to the narrative, all that happens between Mary Magdalene and Jesus in the garden is therefore a revelatory exchange of words. Mary's recognition of Jesus is stirred by her hearing his voice call her name. This makes her turn towards him, and in her account to the other disciples afterwards, the emphasis is on her seeing and hearing him. Mary is by Jesus directed away from him and to his brothers and sisters to proclaim a new degree of intimacy in their shared relationship to God. They no longer belong to this world, but they are not yet permitted to follow Jesus in his departure or ascent. Do Jesus' words to Mary that she should not touch him because he is not yet ascended imply that she and others may indeed touch the already ascended Jesus? This has made interpreters ask whether a moment where the suspended ascension takes place or the process of ascending is completed may be defined within the story itself, since the prohibition seems no longer to be valid at a later appearance when Thomas is present and invited to touch. Is it possible to determine the liminal phase in respect of its beginning and its end? And in case it is possible, to which degree is it relevant? This cannot be answered without understanding how the discourse of Jesus' exaltation and glorification on the cross is interacting with the ascension discourse. In his compelling 1972 article, Men from Heaven in Johannine Sectarianism, when Meeks addresses this problem of seemingly competing discourses and makes some observations of great significance in respect of John 20:17. Meeks notes that John's dramatic compression of exaltation and crucifixion into one leaves the traditional Easter appearances in a kind of limbo, and the strange statement in 2017 imparts to this limbo a sacred liminality. Jesus is no longer in the world, but not yet ascended. He belongs to the intermediate zone that violates these categories and renders him untouchable. That is right. A less poignant way of expressing this dilemma is to view the movement beginning with the exaltation on the cross as a prolonged process of ascending. And the garden scene, the present tense of the verb, indicates that Jesus' ascent is not concluded but an ongoing process. Hence, the Noli Me Tangere story is an interpretative vehicle designed to mark that the transition is in fact underway and to anticipate the gift of the Spirit which still lies ahead. Jesus is redirecting Mary to a new type of relationship which will come only through the Spirit. In her Harvard dissertation, I'm sorry to mention that name, from some years back, Catherine Playost does reconcile the two discourses, but maintains that two distinct timings of the ascensions are held in tension by John. The principal timing is the crucifixion, exploiting the ambiguity of the term hypson. and this timing bears the weight in most of the text. The other timing is an event following the resurrection, and thus separate from both crucifixion and resurrection. This latter timing is stated explicitly only at 2017, but is completed by the time the first upper room scene with the disciples occurs, and they receive the gift of the Spirit. So she tries to define it in the text itself, and many would do the same in that particular period. Before the upper room scene takes place, liminality is past. The transition is just complete after Jesus' encounter with Mary and before his meeting with a whole group of disciples and the episode with the doubting Thomas. Also, Harold Attridge sees the exaltation as a process not completed on the cross, but taking place before the very eyes of Mary. Once that process is complete, Jesus can appear to his disciples and give them the gift of the Spirit, which then takes place 2 verses further on. It is the implication inherent in the message with which Jesus sends Mary to his brothers and sisters, that he is now ascending to his Father, his God and their God, that makes this attempt at timing possible and not ridiculous. A possible sign or demarcation of the transitory liminal phase is thus the absence and presence of the Spirit. A Danish scholar, Caspar Bro Larsen, has shown that Jesus' final appearance to his disciples inversely mirrored the initial catena of narratives in John 1, 35-51, but John calls his first disciples, so it's dismantled in a way in this final scene in chapter 20. Immediately preceding this catena is the report by John the Baptist saying that he has witnessed the Spirit descend from heaven like a dove and remaining on Jesus. Whether Jesus was baptized by John or not, and whether water was involved or not, remains in the dark, and my interpretation of this is that according to John, Jesus does not undergo water baptism, but that's another article, which I have written. The attention is focused on John's attestation of the Spirit descending from heaven and remaining on Jesus, thereby defining him as the Son of God and the one who will baptize not in water but in Spirit. This is the beginning of his mission, and his death completes it. At the very moment when Jesus on the cross declares that all is completed, he also by his dying breath hands over the Spirit, at that stage with the recipient remaining open and unsaid. Not until 1922, which is the episode after the one we have been dealing with, after the encounter with Mary Magdalene, does he confer the Spirit to his disciples as he breathes on them like God make the earth creature come to life in the Garden of Eden. Thus the period between Jesus giving up the Spirit on the cross and his handing it over to the disciples might represent an intermediary liminal period during which he should not be touched. He is elusive, no longer in the world, and not yet ascended. His tomb is empty, but his whereabouts are unclear. He is nowhere and potentially everywhere. The meeting with Mary in the garden by the tomb calls off the search of the body. It also makes clear that Jesus is not to be found unless he himself chooses to show. The disciples are not finders of his presence, they are receivers. In the appearance which follows, to the group of disciples in the locked room, and even more so in the later Thomas episode, there is an emphasis on the physicality of the body of Jesus. The wounds referring to his crucifixion and the tangible nature of these signs. Disciples who are not present at the crucifixions are shown the evidence of it. He also commissions them and breathes the Spirit to them, effectively completing the generation from above. They have now become children of God, begotten as well as born, not of blood, not of the will of flesh or the will of man, but of God. And they are, all of them together, given the powers of the keys to release and retain sins. This is in preparation for my last lecture, that particular phrase. The liminal condition, which caused the prohibition, appears no longer to be present or pertinent. And this has led some, not to say many, to assume that the ascension somehow must have taken place between the two episodes. But why is the only notable difference in the later appearances that the allegedly ascended heavenly Jesus, who has even more of a marked physical presence than in the scene with Mary, indeed may be touched? Why should the ascended Jesus be tangible, whereas the not yet ascended Jesus was not? In the article mentioned, Wayne Meeks has another compelling observation. In the Gospel of John, descent and ascent language is abundant, but descent and ascent are not treated in the symmetrical fashion one might expect. It is not a nice U-turn. Ascent is a far more complex connection of more independent motifs, and it's constantly open to misunderstanding. Moreover, whereas the Gospel of John refers both to the descent and the ascent of Jesus, neither is actually described, and seems rather to represent a claim which serves as an explanation of something else. And I quote, "The motive belongs exclusively to discourse and not to narrative," unquote. It is used to identify Jesus by assuming an origin from above, and the pattern of descending and ascending becomes the cipher for Jesus' unique self-knowledge, as well as his foreignness to the man sick of this world. It's a long time ago. So it was when man was what we wrote. It characterizes Jesus as the stranger par excellence. Jesus is in liminal transit from his corporeal presence among his disciples to an absence when he is replaced by the Spirit and by the written word, so that faith and life in his name still is possible. At the same time, his disciples are in a corresponding liminal transition, as they by the Spirit are generated to become children of God. Thus, the most notable change is to be discerned in relational terms. Jesus is redefining his relationship to his disciples by employing a combination of kinship and covenant language. The kinship terms reflect an increase of intimacy. They have earlier been upgraded from servants to friends in chapter 15, and now they become his brothers and sisters as children begotten and born of God. A previous state has been abandoned, and a new, with other forms of status and relationships, a community in the Spirit has not yet been fully achieved or created. For the disciples as children of God, a prolonged state of liminality is established, they are still in this world, but not of it. That's a typical liminal statement. As he lives, they will live. And they shall know that he is in his Father, and that between him and they there is, through the shared Spirit, a reciprocal indwelling. Thereby the convention and notion of above and below collapses. And Jesus' resurrection appears to have eliminated spatial and temporal distance. As already mentioned, such categories do in John not belong so much to the narrative framework or to narration as to discourse, expressing origin and belonging. Rather than determining the moment of ascension, and thereby claiming that all later appearances are by the ascended Jesus, he oscillates from being the one who ascends, descends, and reascends to guide believers into being the way himself, so that he becomes the unique mode of knowing and seeing the Father. The Thomas episode represents a final round of negotiations, which deal with the question of those who are not present, and that's important, those who are not present when it happened. Those who are in a position where neither touch nor sight is possible. Thomas has already been mentioned 2 times in the Gospel narrative, and his role seems to be to pose conditions for faith and knowledge on the basis of his own understanding. Unlike Mary Magdalene, he has not been present at the cross, and moreover, in chapter 20, we learn he was also absent when Jesus conveyed the Spirit to his disciples as they were gathered behind locked doors, or in the upper room, as is often said. He will not believe unless he can see for himself, and put my finger in the marks of the nails and my hand in his side. Unless I can do that, I will not believe. A week later, Jesus repeats Thomas's very words and invites him to act on them. I'm not going into the discussion about whether this is a docetic position or whether that kind of thing. I think it's much simpler than that. A week later, Jesus repeats Thomas's very words and invites him to act on them. However, just as there in the garden scene is no clear indication that Mary actually did what she was told not to do, there is in the case of Thomas no account as to the fact that he did what he was invited to do. There is no probing with a finger into the wound of Jesus' side. Caravaggio has a lot to answer for. He does not respond by touching. He responds by saying, "My Lord and my God." The great majority of interpreters who assume that both Mary and Thomas, or one or the other, did touch Jesus, do so by implication. The text is tellingly silent. Mary Magdalene and Thomas, the one who came early and the one who came late, framing the middle story of Jesus in the closed room with a collective group of disciples, both involved in negotiations of physicality and touch in a situation of liminality. Hearing and seeing should be sufficient. And in his concluding response to Thomas, "Have you believed because you have seen me?" Jesus continues by limiting the sensual register even further. "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet come to believe." These words represent in the narrative a projection of the future situation of believers who can neither touch nor see. They have come to believe not by any evidence of Jesus being bodily present, but by the gospel about him as it is being told and eventually written, that is heard and read. Indeed, as the early author or editor of the gospel states in his conclusion, this is written so that you believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. The resurrected and ascending Jesus in John 20 in liminal transit from tangibility to text. He is returning to being Logos. Blessed are those who have not touched and not seen, and yet have come to faith, so that they may have life in his name. And that is the conclusion of the gospel. Thank you.
Thank you very much for opening up this text for us in a variety of ways. Professor Carlson-Same will field her own questions, so when you want to ask a question, please identify yourself for her. We shouldn't take too many questions.
No, I've used your time as well as mine.
One question, if it was long, too quick.
Yes.
Well, I will ask a question. In the second text with Thomas, doesn't the frame that appears in both settings, when the disciples are together without Thomas and when Thomas is in with them, that the doors are shut and then Jesus stands in there? And doesn't that make it clear that Jesus has to be in some way in a liminal space, that is, for him to say to Thomas, there, touch me, whereas he said to Mary Magdalene, don't touch me. It's clear that the body is somehow not the same as the body that was laid in the tomb.
There are two answers to this, and they may be contradictory. To answer the last part first, it is the same body. I mean, that is the part he shows the marks. And the marks are the most important feature in that story, because it shows that it's the same body that was crucified and then laid in the tomb. On the other hand, of course, the liminality continues until he goes, until he no longer reappears. And, or I think I would concede that it expires at the blessing. I'll have to think more about that. But it's clearly that the bodily signs in the garden, it plays less role than it does in the episode with Thomas, where the marks of the crucifixion is the marks by which he is identified. While with Mary, it's by voice and sound. Yes.
Judy Henry. So picking up on your descriptions of the text is uninterested in the actions of Mary or Thomas, but really focusing on Jesus' commands to each of them and the contrast between those commands. Could you go a step further and say that perhaps the commands are intended to portray Mary as the disciple who does not need to believe through seeing and touching, whereas, so to speak, she's graduated to that new form of believing, not on the basis of touch. Whereas Thomas is presented as a different kind of disciple who remains at that level pre-resurrection. Is that possible to extend it?
Yeah, many do that. It's not uncommon to make that observation. I hesitate different things. And that both is part of the wisdom that is needed to understand how this whole story ends. And it may be interesting that Mary is a woman and Thomas is a man, but I don't see that as being very important in the story itself at this stage. I think the tradition about Mary Magdalene in the garden are very fixed tradition, very solid tradition. There are some later manuscripts or fragments that would place the mother there as Mary. And I'm not convinced by that. It would fit my understanding of the mother of Jesus in the gospel very well, but I think that's not true. And I hesitated to start using them didactically. Is that how you say it, didactically?
Yes.
And sort of psychologically in this, even though there might be elements of that. But it's a very common approach to trace the difference. So I've tried to stay away from the common approaches in this lecture and look at to me more exciting things. And because I'm as you will see in my last lecture, I'm concerned about what happened afterwards. How to use them, which directions does it give for the future?
I found myself thinking, listening to your talk about liminality, was of ghost stories. And I wonder if there's an awful lot of material in world folklore about the dead hanging around for a while in a state of being betwixt and between. Now, is the gospel at all informed by any of that? Are there any ground rules, so to speak, when you touch a ghost? Is it permissible? Is it dangerous?
Oh yes, we have this discussion of whether he is a ghost.
Well, or at least a being that
sort of
is no
ghost.
longer alive in the old way, but
Yeah,
is somewhere hasn't come to a final resting.
And you have the discussion in Luke, which I will come to tomorrow, whether he is a pneuma or phantasma, which shows that there were discussions like this. He was actually a ghost just on walkabout from somewhere. And I think that's also why the elements by which he is recognized is so important in this story. What is made to carry recognition? Of course, they had these stories. They were very good at them even in this period of time. And I think these texts play with it, to tease with it, perhaps, that might be some excitement. But for me, chapter 20 in John really deals with how the community is being born to further life as Jesus lives, and that the whole role of the Spirit in that story concerns that too. Of course, that has to do with how I see Aristotelian generation in John as well. It follows those patterns very well.
Good. This discussion has sparked further thoughts and ideas, and we look forward to your lecture tomorrow evening and to further discussion with our speakers. So let's once again thank